Welcome back to the program. We've been focused these last few hours on the breaking news that Tim Fischer, at the age of 73, has died, the former Deputy Prime Minister and Nationals leader. I want to bring in our panel this afternoon. We're going to talk about this and a bunch of other things as well. Liberal MP Jason Falinski and Labor's Patrick Gorman. Good to see you both. Thanks for joining us. Look, I know often a lot of nice things are said when someone dies, but look, Tim Fischer was genuinely loved across the aisle. I think that is fair to say, and there's evidence in the fact that Kevin Rudd appointed him as an ambassador. Kim Beazley said such lovely things on his final day in Parliament. Jason, why do you think that is? Have we become since then, do you think, a bit more hostile in our politics?
Yeah, I do actually, David. I think that Tim was just one of those. Having said that, though, Tim was just one of those rare people. John Howard is often given credit for his reforms to gun ownership in Australia, but I often think the person who really was instrumental in that was Tim Fischer, because the pressure from his supporters, from his party, from everyone that he was surrounded by to cave in on that issue was so immense. And you'd like to think that all of us in Parliament would do the right thing when called upon to do so. But the level of integrity that he showed at that moment, at that time, to stand up to people who were otherwise his supporters was extraordinary. John F. Kennedy wrote a book called Profiles in Courage, and I think if that book had been written after that event, Tim Fischer would have certainly been one of the first few chapters in that book.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Look, Patrick, it's one of the truisms of politics that you've really got to be yourself. You've got to be authentic. That's what voters recognise when someone's faking it. Tim Fischer's another reminder of that story, isn't it?
Yeah, reflecting on his life, it's one of those great things that the more you go and read about his life in Parliament, his life before serving for Australia, conscripted in fact for Australia in the Vietnam War, you realise just what an extraordinary human being he was, and how lucky we were that he chose to dedicate his life to public service. People like Tim Fischer could have done many different things, and I think it's important to recognise how lucky we are that someone like him decided to serve in Parliament. As Jason said, and I agree with him 100%, that lasting legacy of leadership when it comes to gun reforms, where he really had to have some of the most difficult conversations you've seen from a political leader, talking to their own supporters, saying, here's why I'm going to do something you're not going to like, was really amazing. And as you said, David, his appointment to the Holy See was something that just really demonstrated, it's one demonstration of many, that he was truly respected across all sides of politics, and he will be sorely missed.
Yeah, no, he will. Well said. Nice to start with a bit of agreement, at least on that front. Let's talk about some policy matters, though, today. The warning from the energy market operator today that homes and businesses in the eastern states are at high risk of blackouts this summer, particularly in Victoria. Unreliable coal and gas generators being blamed there. What's the government going to do about this, Jason Falinski, between now and the summer?
So, David, at the risk of getting you offside for the rest of the interview, I think what AEMO was actually saying was that gas and coal-fired power stations that provide reliable dispatchable power have been replaced with unreliable variable power sources, in particular renewable energy. In terms of what the federal...
I think it was pointing to the breakdown that's happened at Loy Yang A power station in the Latrobe Valley, and also the AGL gas generator in Victoria. These are not at full capacity, and they're expressing a doubt they will be at full capacity by the summer or through the summer. That's
true. They also point to Hazelwood, and that the majority of Hazelwood's power has been replaced with variable renewable energy, which is creating, and they're often put at points of great stress in the system, which means that you can't often utilise those power sources as often as you want, and those power sources
are never... So what's the government going to do?
Sorry. So the government, thank you. So the government is obviously building Snowy Hydro 2.0. We're backing the battery of the nation, which is the Tasmanian electricity project.
They're years away, though. They're several years away, 4, 5, 6 years away. What about this summer?
So I would say to you on that point that AEMO makes the point over and over and over again that this problem didn't just come about. It's because governments weren't looking years into the future, and they're actually saying that the real problem starts in 2023 when Liddell needs to be replaced. What we've done this summer is we've released 560 emergency megawatt hours into the system that will keep 1.3 million households in Victoria with power and lights during this summer. But this situation is unsustainable unless we start planning for tomorrow today, and that is why Snowy Hydro is part of that, battery is part of the Tasmanian project is part of that, and obviously keeping Liddell going for a period of time is part of that as well.
Audrey Zibelman, the head of AEMO,
Yes.
is also making some pretty pointed remarks here as to what the government should do. She says, quote, "At present, AEMO does not have the tools or mechanisms to enable cost-effective access to sufficient resources for all hours of the year. So we are forced to use more emergency actions that impose unnecessary risk and cost on consumers just at a time where the goal is to pursue more cost-effective outcomes."
Yep.
I mean, do you see that as a message to the government that it needs to put rules in place, mechanisms, tools that she's talking about here?
Yeah, well, I'm going to try and be nice at this point in time and say we have another regulator.
You're always nice, Jason.
Well, thank you, Patrick. That's there are some people who disagree with you. I'll get their numbers for you. But the regulator, we have another regulator calling for yet more power. Having said that, without wanting to be narky about it, the federal government on both sides has consistently put in place legislation, regulations that give AEMO the powers that it needs when it needs them to ensure that we have electricity in those parts of the market in the most cost-effective way. Now, if the chair of AEMO has a view that there are different ways of doing it that are more efficient and more cost-effective, then we will obviously look at doing that, and there would be no reason.
She was a big supporter of the National Energy Guarantee, helped design the thing that you voted for about a year ago to the day. Were you wrong then in voting for that, or are you wrong now?
So I think that in answer to that very technical question, there were some problems.
Not technical at all.
Well, there were problems with the... the National Energy Guarantee was the way that we dealt with the price issues in the electricity market, and also how we dealt with reducing carbon emissions out of the electricity market. We implemented the first part of that. The second part of that we're dealing with through a $3.5 billion fund in terms of carbon emission reduction fund. That is doing the job it is meant to do. The sector is generally saying that they would like a mechanism and a structure in which they can better plan that, which will allow them to make more investments. We need to continue to have more discussions with them to get that design right.
All right, so this is still a work in progress, your energy policy?
Well, it's fair to say that our nation is a work in progress, David, so we'll continue to work hard on it.
All right, Patrick Gorman, can you... Sorry, Patrick, let me ask you a question. Can you explain to me what Labor's policy is right now on climate and energy, and whether you have a policy on climate and energy?
Well, I think it's well known to all of your viewers, David, that Labor is going through a difficult but thorough policy review process. Every one of those policies that we took to the election, we are going through the process of reviewing. At the moment, it would be better if the government had a clearer energy policy than it does. We've said many times that we've had 15 energy policies, but there is no clear guidance.
But do you have one? I mean, I'm not trying to make fun here, but you don't actually have one.
No. All of our policies are under review. That's exactly what you'd expect after the message that was sent to us from the Australian people in May of this year.
And do you have an inclination at the moment as to what would be the best course of action?
Well, I don't want to see people bashing up on renewable energy. Renewable energy is a really important part of our electricity mix for the future. I think we should listen to these regulators when they say that there is a problem. Labor hasn't been in government for coming on 6 years. I think we're just 2 weeks away from that 6-year mark. So I think it's hard for the government to point any of these problems at Labor's feet.
It's hard for Labor to criticise the government, I suppose. If you don't have a policy, it is pretty hard to get stuck into the government.
Well, look, I also say I'm sitting here in Western Australia. The power that's coming to this studio is not part of the national energy market. It comes from the southwest grid. One of the things that does frustrate many Western Australians whenever these debates flare up is that it is the very classic example of an eastern states only policy debate. And if we're going to have a real national energy policy, it needs to include all of the states, not just those that are connected through the national grid.
All right, let's move on. You mentioned the fact the coalition's been in government for 6 years. Let's talk about industrial relations, because Jason Falinski, you and a couple of your Liberal colleagues wrote a fascinating piece in the Financial Review this week. Let me quote from it.
Thank you.
The system,
Thank you, David. I thought it was quite
You talk about the IR system, you say the system lacks collaboration, pragmatism and fairness, much less being an aid for productivity. Now, as I say, you've been in government 6 years. That's a pretty damning indictment. How have things got so bad on your watch?
Well, thank you for putting it in those terms, David. I really appreciate you framing the debate that way. And by the way, that's sarcasm. Look, I think the piece was mostly aimed at saying that it's almost 10 years to the day that the Fair Work Act came into force. The question is, how has that act evolved as time has gone on over that 10-year period? And I think when you go and look at the documents that Julia Gillard issued in 2007, which was called Forward with Fairness, and you judge the outcomes of the Fair Work Act against that document, there is some places where the Act could be improved. Now, that's not to have a go at Julia Gillard, that's not what we're seeking to do, or to have a go at the Fair Work Act.
And so what are the improvements? What are the improvements you'd like?
Well, I mean, the key improvement we would like to see is a more collaborative industrial relations framework where employers and employees can speak to each other openly about what changes they can make in the workplace that improves their lives, their jobs, their enterprises, and that ultimately flows through into higher wages, more employment opportunities, etc. So they're the sorts of changes that we're looking at. But you know what? If you just go and look back at Forward with Fairness, Julia Gillard has some really great ideas in there, and they're probably worth going back and saying, maybe we need to amend the Fair Work Act to take into account of, firstly, how some of the laws got interpreted, which was not her intention, the way that they got interpreted, and secondly, how the labour force or the labour market has changed in the intervening period of 10 years. And
but I think in terms of an actual change, I mean, I hear what you're saying, that you want workers and bosses to talk more and work together. What do you need to change to do that?
Well, for example, we cite in that article an example of a construction company that in 2012 started the process of an enterprise agreement. By 2015, it abandoned that process because it was getting tripped up at every hearing in front of the Fair Work Commission. And so they decided just to go back and get it and start again, so the technical requirements, they wouldn't keep falling over. 2 years later, the company and its workforce voted and approved an enterprise agreement, and it was in November 2017. They took that to the Fair Work Commission. In March of 2018, a union that has no members at that enterprise sought the right of automatic representation. It was granted that right by the Fair Work Commission, which is allowed under the Act. In April of that year, another union then complained to the Fair Work Commission that it should have the automatic right of representation.
Third parties should not be able to intervene.
David, you've got to hear the whole story. Basically, what then happens is...
We don't have a lot of time.
Oh, I know.
We don't have all the time that we'd like, but...
No, I know. But what happens is the Commission rules that one union has representation over the other. They then take it to a full bench hearing. The full bench hearing overturns the original commissioner. They then take that to the federal court. By the way, at this point, this has now taken 18 months.
So what's the change, just quickly? What's the change you'd like here?
I think, for example, that where a company and its workforce agree on an enterprise agreement, that the Fair Work Commission should certainly sign off on that and make sure that it meets better off overall tests.
So third parties can't get involved.
But why are registered organisations without any members, without any representation, able to fight amongst themselves and hold that process up for more than 2 years?
OK, just quickly, Patrick, what's wrong with that?
Well, one of the things that Jason kind of just tried to imply is that unions don't have a right at the table when it comes to discussing industrial matters.
Unions that don't have any workers, any skin in the game with workers they represent.
Well, I think that when you look at the example of construction companies, often they negotiate these matters very early on in their construction projects before they've actually started hiring the vast bulk of their workforce. So it actually makes a lot of sense that you'd seek to involve the union that is going
but
to
just to be
represent
clear,
the hundreds
sorry,
of
we don't want
workers.
time, but if the
this
union
isn't-
doesn't have
Patrick,
any
this wasn't a
workers
greenfield-
in this deal...
Yeah, this wasn't a greenfield
if the
site.
union does not have a single worker that's affected, should they be able to interfere in that deal?
Well, I think it's reasonable that a union would have a voice at the Fair Work Commission. It's ultimately for the Fair Work Commission to decide.
That's not what I'm asking.
whether or
I'm
not
saying if
that
a
voice
union
has
doesn't have any workers affected by the deal, should they be able to intervene?
Well, I don't think Jason's example was saying they don't have any workers affected by the deal. I think
No,
the example
they
was
have
didn't have
no
any current
representation.
members.
No one at the company is a member of either of the union, and the two unions
Yeah, but
fighting amongst
that's
themselves
different
have
not
now stopped an enterprise agreement being implemented for over 2 years. I don't think that's fair.
Well,
how's that fair to the
Jason,
workforce and to families and to the company that they work with?
Well, Jason, you're free to send me the details of the specific case. I did read your op-ed, though, and your op-ed spoke a lot about unfair dismissal, which I think was one of the things that I know is definitely not part of
We don't have time to get into unfair dismissal right now. Perhaps, look, we'll have to leave it there. Perhaps if Tom Connell lets me fill in again, we can return to that. And a lot to talk about on the industrial relations front, but we will have to go. Jason Falinski and Patrick Gorman, thanks so much for joining me this afternoon. Appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Thanks, Pat.
Thank you, David, and all the best.
All right.